I was sure that my marriage to Lillian was perfect. We had lived together for 10 years, and nothing indicated that this could change. She was my rock, my perfect soulmate. However, everything started to fall apart from the moment I noticed something unusual in her behavior. At first, it was just a small misunderstanding, strange looks, coming home late from work, constantly missing calls, which were commonplace for us. But when I found that message on her phone, I realized it wasn't just my paranoia. Lillian started acting as if nothing had happened. She was nice, affectionate, even more so than usual. But I felt that it was just a mask. I started paying more attention to the little things, to her looks, to her choice of words. The way she said "I love you," even though I wasn't sure if it was true anymore. I tried to unravel her every move like a chess game, trying to find at least one clue that would lead me to the truth. And then one night changed everything. She went to work as usual, but I stayed home, unable to believe what was happening. I decided to look at her phone again. And this time I found something that made my heart sink. A message that could not be seen as anything other than a betrayal. From her. Lillian was texting with someone I didn't even know her name. And everything I saw was more than just flirting. I couldn't believe it. My mind refused to accept it. She was cheating on me, but why? The one I loved so much was a stranger. I began to investigate. As I slowly unraveled this tangle of lies, I learned that everything was much more complicated than I could have imagined. It turned out that Lillian had not only betrayed me, but also manipulated our financial situation. I didn't understand how she had gotten this far by using me for her own purposes. With each step, I began to realize more and more that my feelings for her were only part of her plan. She was spending my money on other relationships, on luxuries I had never even dreamed of. I felt powerless in the face of her lies, in the face of her shameless manipulation of my feelings. But worst of all, I couldn't stop loving her. Despite the betrayal, despite all her manipulations, I still felt something for her that I couldn't explain. She knew how to play on my feelings. At one point, when I tried to express my pain, she was gentle with me again. Her intimacy, her words, all this plunged me into an emotional pit again. She was using my weaknesses to keep me trapped in her trap. I was angry. Angry at her betrayal, angry at the way she played with my mind. But at the same time, I felt an old love for her that would not let go. And then I realized, it was time to act. I would not just watch her destroy me. My plan was simple but effective. She had to feel every blow, every emotion I had. I would make her feel what I felt. Her betrayal was only the beginning. My plan was not revenge in the classical sense of the word. It was a complex psychological game. She didn't know that I already knew everything. I let her think that everything was the same as before. Meanwhile, I was already starting to change the situation so that she would finally realize what my anger was capable of. Only then would she realize the price she would have to pay for all her lies. My plan began to work. I was calm and invisible to Lillian. She had no idea that I was tracking her every move, that her every gesture was another piece of the puzzle in unraveling her deception. She became more and more confident, thinking that I knew nothing. And that was my advantage. However, one evening when I came home earlier than usual, I saw her on the couch with her phone. Lillian was back in her usual role, sweet, gentle, as if nothing had changed. I stood by the door and watched her behavior. That evening she was too focused on something. She was holding her phone as if she didn't want me to see what was on the screen. My suspicions were instantly confirmed. She apparently didn't realize that I already knew everything, and as soon as she was distracted by some trivialities, I managed to read a few messages that led to another shock. This time her affair was not with one of her former acquaintances. This time, when I read the name in her chat, I felt the ground leave from under my feet. My friend was there. My best friend. James. It turned out that Lillian was not only playing a game with other men, but she was also insidiously using my closest friends, manipulating them for the same purposes. James, whom I trusted, was part of her plan. All these years, he played the perfect role of a friend, but in reality he was her accomplice in everything. They were both betraying me and I had no idea until I came across this message. I became cold and distant. Anger filled my heart, but not in the way I expected. I didn't feel self-pity, but more anger, which was intertwined with the feeling that I had been made a fool of. I knew that my friend was in cahoots with Lillian, but I was tormented by the question, did they really plan it all together, or did it happen by accident? And just when I thought I had figured out all her lies, Lillian started acting differently. She became the Lillian I used to love again, gentle, attractive, and I felt an old love waking up inside me. She was trying to make up for all her faults, which filled our history, and I was blindly agreeing to it. In her eyes, I saw something more: manipulation. She was using our intimate moments not to return my love, but to keep me trapped in her trap. And then, when I realized that I would never be the same person I was, and when my anger reached a climax, I took a step that would change everything. I started to manipulate her. At a time when she thought everything was going back to normal, I started playing by my own rules. I became just like her, cold, ruthless, and ready for any game. And so, when I finally revealed all the cards, I changed the game. From that moment on, I was no longer who I was. My relationship with Lillian changed forever. I felt anger and love intertwined to form something I couldn't even describe in words. I was no longer the naive man who was ready to believe in the sincerity of her feelings. Now I was cool, calculating her every move, every word, every look. But at the same time, I began to feel my old love not letting go of me. I couldn't get rid of this bitter dependence on her. I could feel her manipulations working, how she was starting to flirt with me again, using the same techniques that had kept me in line all these years. Now I was ready for revenge, but not the kind she expected. She continued to believe that I knew nothing. She became even more affectionate, flirting with me even more. Every evening I would come home and she would greet me with a smile, kiss me, trying to do everything to make me forget about what was happening. It was as if she was trying to put everything back in its place. But her every move was deliberate, and I saw it as just another stage of her manipulation. One day I told myself that enough was enough. She thought that I was playing her game, but that was only part of my plan. I started to draw her attention to other men. Of course, it was all just a game, but she didn't know that I was already in full control. I became more and more involved in my career, became more distant from her, but at the same time I started to drag her into situations where she should have been concerned. Every night when I was home, I would let her think everything was fine, and then, like a black cat, I would sneak up on her again. But the most interesting thing happened a week later, when I found out that she was trying to manipulate my finances even more. It turns out that everything she did to me was just part of her plan, a plan that was supposed to make me dependent on her decisions. She decided to transfer all of our money to her accounts without giving me even the slightest chance to influence the situation. And then I realized, the moment had come. I gathered all my strength and did what seemed impossible. I threw away everything I felt for her and broke her plan. All this time, as I watched Lillian walk her line, I was plotting my strategy. I knew she would start to feel the pressure when I stopped responding to her manipulations. And so, the moment came when I put her in front of a choice. A choice between losing everything or agreeing to my terms again. She had no choice. Lillian tried to put things back together again, but I was no longer the man she knew. She started to notice the changes. I stopped reacting to her manipulations, stopped being that kind man who forgave everything. I was calm, collected, and cold, and it worried her. She couldn't understand why I had changed so much. However, she didn't even realize that it was just part of my plan. Every time she tried to bring my attention back to her, I would move even further away. I started focusing more and more on work, spending more time outside the house. And it was at this point that she started making mistakes. Her lies became more and more obvious. One evening when I came home, I saw that her face looked strange. She was trying to hide something, but I could see it even in her eyes. I didn't say a word, just sat at the table and watched. She tried to be polite, but I could feel that her thoughts were not focused on me. And then, when I became even more distant, Lillian decided that she had to act. She tried to charm me again, to put all her manipulations back in place, but I remained cold, silent as a stone. That evening she did something I hadn't expected. She became tender with me again, arranged a romantic dinner, and I felt like she wanted me to believe in her remorse. But this moment was just another part of her game. She said something I couldn't help but hear: "I made a mistake, but I'm ready to fix it." This was not true. She wasn't trying to fix her behavior. She wanted to take control of the situation again. And it was when she tried again to use her intimate wiles to win back my affection that I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I was no longer willing or able to be a victim of her manipulations. I did what I had been planning for a long time. That night I did something that silenced her forever. Lillian tried to put things back to normal, but I was no longer the person she knew. She started to notice the changes. I stopped reacting to her manipulations, stopped being that kind man who forgave everything. I was calm, collected, and cold, and it worried her. She couldn't understand why I had changed so much. However, she didn't even realize that it was just part of my plan. Every time she tried to bring my attention back to her, I would move even further away. I started focusing more and more on work, spending more time outside the house. And it was at this point that she started making mistakes. Her lies became more and more obvious. One evening when I came home, I saw that her face looked strange. She was trying to hide something, but I could see it even in her eyes. I didn't say a word, just sat at the table and watched. She tried to be polite, but I could feel that her thoughts were not focused on me. And then, when I became even more distant, Lillian decided that she had to act. She tried to charm me again, to put all her manipulations back in place, but I remained cold, silent as a stone. That evening she did something I did not expect. She became tender with me again, arranged a romantic dinner, and I felt like she wanted me to believe in her remorse. But this moment was just another part of her game. She said something I couldn't help but hear: "I made a mistake, but I'm ready to fix it." This was not true. She wasn't trying to fix her behavior. She wanted to take control of the situation again. And it was when she tried again to use her intimate wiles to win back my affection that I decided I couldn't wait any longer. Every day that followed became even more difficult for Lillian. She couldn't understand why I had become so indifferent, why I didn't respond to her attempts to regain my attention. Her tactics were losing their power. But at the same time, I noticed how deeply she was sinking into her manipulations. Every move she made was calculated, every word carefully chosen. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room working on the computer, she quietly approached me. I felt her presence even before I saw her. That familiar smell of perfume, the gentle footsteps that sounded like a mosaic of my memories. She stood next to me and watched me, not knowing that I already knew all her secrets. "Don't you want to talk?" Her voice was so familiar, but not as sincere as before. I felt that behind these words was just another attempt at manipulation, another trap she was setting for me. But at the same time, I felt old feelings flare up inside me, as if my heart had trembled. I turned to her. She was standing in front of me, dressed in the same dress in which I first fell in love with her. I saw her eyes, the same as before, and she was so close that I could feel her warmth. But now everything was different. My anger was deep, like a shadow that was slowly consuming everything around me. "What do you want, Lillian?" I kept my voice low, but every word was laced with coldness. She moved even closer to me, trying to regain my attention, but I didn't move. Her movements became slower and more cautious. I saw her face change from trying to manipulate me to realizing that her game wasn't working. I want you to forgive me," she said quietly. I could feel her voice trembling. And although she was still trying to play on my feelings, I couldn't help but notice that there was a different tone in her words: fear. She didn't know if she would be able to put everything back in its place again. I walked up to her, our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something I hadn't expected: tears in her eyes. They were real, but not for the reasons I had imagined. She was afraid of losing me, and it wasn't just a fear of losing her husband. She was afraid that I would realize why her words no longer had any power. But the more I looked at her, the more anger and love mixed in my heart. I was trapped. My angry need for revenge was in conflict with the fact that I still loved her. Part of me was the same old attachment she had manipulated for so long. I made a decision. Forgive me? I smiled, but it wasn't the smile she had once loved so much. No, Lillian. I can't do that. You don't deserve this. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold back her emotions, but I could see her expression changing. She realized that whatever she had done no longer had power over me. Do you think I don't understand? I drew closer and she stepped back, feeling her control over the situation melting away. My hand touched her cheek, but not gently. I realized that I could no longer be the weak man she knew. And then, when she tried to make one last attempt to get everything back, I decided to do something she did not expect. An invisible wall stood between us. Lillian was no longer trying to lie to my face. Her smile faded, and though she tried to remain calm, I could see her hands trembling. She wanted me to forgive her, but I was already too far gone to go back to the times we were together without these lying masks. I couldn't play her game anymore. I summoned all my strength to put aside my emotions and stay cool, even though everything was boiling inside. I knew that this time she would not be able to melt my heart with her tears and manipulations. Did you think I wouldn't see you? I said, although my head was full of questions that I didn't even want to hear the answers to. I know everything, Lillian. You're not alone, and your lies are worse than just betrayal. You betrayed me in every sense. I saw her expression change. For a moment she was stunned, as if she had been hit. But she quickly pulled herself together, and I could feel her inner strength taking over again. Edward, it's not what it seems. I did everything I could to make us happy. Her voice began to soften again, but I didn't believe her anymore. I had seen this deception before. I approached her, keeping my eyes on her, but there was no pity in my heart. I saw her eyes gently darken, and it made me feel a kind of cold calm. She was again trying to impose her reality, her lies on me, and at that moment I realized that it was all just another attempt to leave me in her web. But instead of answering, I did something she didn't expect. I moved even closer and kissed her without warning. It wasn't a gentle kiss, not the kind that had once brought back memories of happiness for both of us. It was a kiss full of emotional betrayal, pain and disappointment. I wanted her to feel how I had changed. Lillian stood motionless, not knowing what to say as I pulled away from her. I realized that this was the last moment she could try to win back my affection, but now it was too late. I no longer had the feelings for her that I once had. You can't manipulate me anymore, Lillian, I said quietly, returning to the table. She stood in the shadows, looking at me silently, as if I had become a stranger to her. But this cold blow I delivered was only part of my game. I started to move away even more, but every day brought me new discoveries. I found more evidence of her lies, more details that I hadn't noticed before. It turned out that she hadn't just cheated on me, she had moved our finances to completely different accounts. And now that I was too deep in this game, I decided that she would not be able to get away from me. One evening I made a demand of her. She came home and I was ready for anything that could happen. I was calm, cold, and her manipulations had no effect. Do you want me to forgive you? Do you want to take it all back? I asked. Then do what I say. Otherwise, everything you're trying to hide will become obvious to everyone. She seemed desperate. Her eyes were filled with fear. Fear of losing everything she had built, and fear from me because I was no longer the man she had once known. The next day, I left Lillian with her choice. She sat in silence in the kitchen, and her every look was full of struggle, as if she was trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. She had no support. I was the man she wanted to leave, and at the same time the one who had her fate in his hands. I saw her hands trembling as she tried to gather the documents to meet with her lawyer. It was her last attempt to maintain control, but I knew she had already lost. All her movements were too fast, too nervous. This was not the Lillian I had once loved. I went up to her and said quietly, "You don't have to try so hard. I know everything. Do you want to continue this performance?" She looked up and I saw a tear rolling down her cheek. It was sincere disappointment, but also fear she didn't know if she could hold me any longer. Her face looked tired, as if she had been trying to lie not only to me but to herself all this time. "I'll do everything to make it right." Her voice was barely audible, but it still had a touch of manipulation. She was still trying to get my attention, to make me believe that it was all fixable, like old mistakes. But I was already so far away from her that these words had no power. I could feel the old love that had once made me forgive everything now surfacing in me with a feeling of disgust. She did not deserve my forgiveness. And this moment became critical for both of us. "You can't manipulate me anymore, Lillian," I repeated, keeping my voice low, but every word was like a hammer blow. She fell back into her chair, her face darkening. I saw her mind begin to analyze the situation, and she realized that her tricks were no longer working. I knew that this time she would not be able to run away from me, would not be able to avoid responsibility for everything she had done. The next day, when we stayed at home, I decided to act. I found evidence of financial fraud that she had been hiding for a long time. After collecting all these facts, I realized that this would be my final point in our breakup. She came home, and I gave her a real choice. Her face turned pale when she saw that I was holding in front of me the documents that confirmed her lies. She tried to say something, but no words came out. "You think I didn't notice all this?" My words sounded harsh. "You deceived me at every level. And now you have two options: either you confess to everything, or I will publicly expose you." Her eyes filled with tears, but I saw more desperation than remorse in them. She knew that everything I had gathered could not be reversed. She could no longer manipulate me. This moment, when I felt like I was holding her life in my hands, was decisive. All the emotions I once had for her disappeared. I saw how she was trying to take control, but now it was not for me, but for herself. "I don't want your apology," I whispered, and I immediately realized that these were not just words. It was final. I had finished everything we had started. Lillian no longer had a right to any part of my life. I had been waiting for this moment. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew that this meeting would change everything. She came home late at night, when I was ready to expose her completely. I sat in the dark, and the only thing I could hear was my heart beating hard and fast. Everything inside of me was raising the alarm, but I knew it was necessary. She came into the room, and when she saw me, her face turned pale. She knew that I had already found out everything. And although I was calm on the outside, inside I was empty. Empty of love, empty of deception. "Edward," her voice was quiet, but she clearly sounded anxious. She tried to find the words to justify herself, but they didn't come. All these years of her manipulating my feelings were meaningless, and now, in this moment, I realized that it was all just empty words. "Do you still want to lie to me?" I said. My voice was so cold that it frightened even me. I raised my hand and showed her the documents, the treacherous accounts, their use, her financial fraud. She was trapped, and she knew it. "Lillian, you did all this. Everything we had was built on a lie." My hand was shaking, but I wasn't going to show her any weakness. She stood in front of me, her eyes full of tears. Her face seemed both broken and angry. I could see her trying to hold on, but she was losing more and more control with every passing second. "Please, don't." "Edward," her voice broke. She fell to her knees in front of me, her tears falling to the floor, but I had no desire to wipe them away. My soul was overwhelmed with emotions that I could no longer hold in. It was a feeling of betrayal that squeezed my heart to the breaking point. I gritted my teeth and ripped out these painful words. "How could you do this to me?" I couldn't control my voice. It was trembling, filled with pain. All those years we had been together seemed to mean nothing to her. How could you despise a person who trusted, loved, and gave herself without a trace? You've made an idiot of me, I turned to her, and it was said with such force that Lillian almost recoiled. My eyes were burning, but there was no love in them anymore. Now there was only anger. Anger that she had broken me, that I had once been willing to do anything to satisfy her. She grabbed my hand, trembling. Edward, I can't live like this anymore. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I love you. Her voice was pitiful, but my eyes remained cold. I couldn't believe these words because I realized that this was another attempt at manipulation. Love? I looked at her with nothing but despair in my eyes. You destroyed everything we had. That wasn't love. It was just manipulation. You thought I would be your victim. But I won't be controlled by you anymore. Her face was wrinkled from crying, and I could see that she could no longer keep the mask on. She was desperate. Her tears could not arouse any pity in me. She had destroyed my heart, and now it was no longer able to sympathize with her. You can't manipulate me anymore, I said for the last time. My heart was clenching, but I could feel myself losing the last of my feelings for her. The silence between us became deafening. Lillian, trying to keep herself together, stood up, her hands shaking. She took a step back, as if looking for a way out, and I realized that this was our last meeting. All the emotions that once united us had simply evaporated. She was just a woman who had betrayed me, and nothing more. I can't be with you anymore. I looked at her with an alienation that frightened even me. There was no longer the warmth in her eyes that I had once seen. Now there was only despair and lost hope. With the words, "This is the end," I left. My soul was empty, but I knew it was the only right thing to do. That meeting was the culmination of everything, and I had no one or anything else to bring me back. Now there was only anger and determination to go all the way.